So, you don't know SQL, but you want to. You've come to the right place. In this video, I'm going to teach you the 5 most fundamental SQL beginner concepts that you need before you can really start learning. I'm going to teach you about what a database is, what a table is, and how the select, from, and where clauses work in SQL. To do so, we're going to make a trip down to SQL Mart, which is a fictional grocery store that is going to illustrate what a database is. I know it's a little bit corny, but I just find the analogy helpful, so bear with me. Now, in SQL Mart, as you might imagine with any grocery store, there's a lot of different items. And each of these items has some data that we'd like to store about that item, right? So in the produce section, we might want to store when something arrived, what its expiration date is, what type of item it is, things like that, how much it costs. Whereas in other sections, we might want to store some different information, like paper towels have no need to store their expiration date. Or almond milk, we might need to know what temperature it's supposed to be refrigerated at. So in our SQL Mart database, we have a decision to make. Should we store data about all the items together, knowing that we'll have some information about items that isn't relevant to other items and vice versa? Probably not, right? That's where the concept of a table comes in. A table is simply where data is actually stored logically within a database. So in SQL Mart, each section would have its own table because each section has similar items that we want to store the same information about. Everything in the produce section is going to have an expiration date, right? Everything in the refrigerated section is going to have a temperature which it's supposed to be stored at, right? So it makes more sense to store these pieces of information for all of these similar items together in tables. So what is a table? Well, let's take a look at an example. What we've got here is the produce table in SQL Mart. It has a few different pieces of data for every record in the table, right? Category, item, price, arrival date, expiration date, and quantity. And each row in the table represents an item in the produce section. So we've got Gala apples, Fuji red apples, orange carrots, and long asparagus. That's how a table works. Each row in the table represents a record, which is just one item. Each column in the table represents a piece of information that we'd like to store about the items in the table. So in this case, like I said, the category, the quantity, etc. So now you know what a database is and what a table is. Let's get into what you really came here for and start writing a SQL query. The first of the 3 SQL statements that I told you about earlier that we're going to learn is actually the from statement. If you know anything about SQL, it might seem a little backwards because the from statement comes after the select statement in the order of the query, but in this case, I think it's helpful to start with the from statement, and I think you'll see why. The from statement in SQL is where we tell it which table we're interested in selecting information from, as the name suggests. So in this case, we're going to start with the produce table because we're going to be making an apple pie. We've got a recipe that we're going to follow for this apple pie, and so we need some information about the apples that the store has in stock. And that's where the select statement comes into play. The select statement is how we tell SQL which columns or pieces of information we want it to retrieve for us from the table. In this case, like I said, we're making an apple pie. So what sort of information do we need? Well, we need the category, so we know which ones are apples. We need the items, so we know which type of apples we're looking at. We need the price, right? We want to know how much money we're going to spend. We need the quantity, because we need to know if there's enough. And we need the expiration date, because we're not planning on baking the pie for a couple of days, and we want to make sure the apples are still going to be good when we actually get around to it. And with that, we've actually got our first fully formed SQL query. If we hit run, we get our result here. And right now it's giving us everything from the produce table. We've got all the apples, we've got the carrots, we've got the asparagus, and we don't really want all of that information. We're making an apple pie. We're not making a carrot cake or something out of asparagus. I don't know what, but we want the apples. So that's where we're going to get into the third statement that I told you about at the beginning, the where statement. The where statement is how we tell SQL which records to filter out of the results of our query. And you can think about it logically, right? The where statement is telling SQL, I'm interested in records where a certain condition is met. So the first condition we're going to put here is where the category is equal to apple. And so if we run this, you see it filters out the carrots and the asparagus. What SQL does is it goes through every row of the results of your query and checks to make sure these conditions are met. If they're not met, it filters them out. So in the first row, it says, is this category equal to apple? Yes. The same for the second, the same for the third. And if you recall before the fourth record, which the category was carrot for, this condition was not met, and so it removed it from the results. This is a great start, but if you remember, I said we're following a recipe. So we know how many apples we're going to need. And in this case, we know we're going to need 8. So what we're going to do is add another condition to our where clause. And we're going to say we want the quantity to be greater than or equal to 8. And the way I'm going to do that is by using what you can see here, which is the and keyword. Essentially, what this allows us to do is chain conditional statements together and have SQL evaluate it so it only returns the records for which every one of those conditional statements is true. So in this case, it's going to check every row to make sure the category is apple and the quantity is greater than or equal to 8. So we're going to see this number 5 guy go away. There you have it. So these are the two types of apples that meet the conditions of our query and therefore the conditions of our recipe. There's one more thing that we could add here, though, that we're probably going to want to do, and that's looking at the expiration date. Let's say today's the 8th, and we know we're going to make our pie on the 12th because we're having a party. What we're going to want to do is add one more condition, and this is a condition based on the expiration date. One of the great things about SQL is when we're working with dates, it's sort of intuitive. If we only want dates that are after January 12th, how do you imagine we would do that? It's similar to what we did with quantity up above. We can actually just use the greater than symbol, and that's one of the things about SQL that makes it really easy to use. So we're going to say, and expiration date is greater than 2025-01-12, and run it. And you see now the only option remaining is the red apple. There's 8 of them, which is how many we need, and it expires on January 15th, which is after we're going to be making our pie. And so there you have it. You've been introduced to SQL as a total beginner. With the from and select and where statements, you can do a lot of good work. There's a ton of stuff that actually only requires these 3 statements to find interesting things in. It might seem a little frivolous in our example here because there's only 5 records in the table. But as you can imagine, most SQL tables have many, many more records than that, some up to hundreds of thousands or even millions. So the ability to filter out all the noise that you're not interested in can become really powerful really quickly. That being said, perhaps the most powerful thing SQL can do for you is actually join tables together. We're not touching on that here because this is for absolute bare bones beginners. But if you want to learn more about joins and you're interested in continuing your SQL learning journey, I've linked a video right here about the different types of SQL joins and how they work.